Cool. All right. Good morning, everyone. How are you all feeling this bright and sunny Sydney morning, hey? My son has been practicing for a skateboard competition for the last 3 months, and today's the day. And I don't know if any of you know much about skateboarding, but wet and skateboarding don't go well together. So the whole event has been cancelled, and he's absolutely devastated, but there we go. Crisis in being a teenager. So yes, my name is AnneMaries Charrett, and today I am going to be talking to you about testing microservices. There is an actual subtitle to this talk. It's a tale of 2 microservices that rapidly grew to overdevelopment into 80 microservices. And you could potentially argue that this was due to a lack of urban planning. However, it is a story. It's a relatively old story now, because we know that in the world of IT, anything that's over a year is pretty much redundant. But I think that we still have some very useful lessons that I learned out of this experience. And very much that I feel that some of the sort of ideas and concepts might be worthwhile sharing, and maybe you can learn from some of the mistakes that we made and some of the things that we really learned that was very useful. All right, so also this is my alter ego. I am known as the badass testing Marshmallow. I'm not going to work that one out for you. I'm not going to tell you the story about that one. It would take way too long. But yeah, so if you ever see the badass testing Marshmallow, you know that I have actually struck and I have been there. So, right. As I said, a story about testing, and no story is good without some sort of setting of the background a long, long time ago. I was working in a fintech, and this fintech was about 250 people. It was founded by 3 engineers, and these engineers founded this fintech, and I think it really showed, because there was a real emphasis on fintech over the fin side. So that was great for us, being in the engineering space, right? Because we didn't really have to argue for budget. It was kind of understood that in order to succeed in the space, we really had to invest in technology, new ideas. And so we were one of the early organizations, at least I feel in Sydney, that started up on the microservices journey. So it was really about 2014 when we first started working on the microservices. A little bit of background. We were the bank for the SMEs. So originally we started off in payments, and we were working on getting a banking license at the time. And our motto was getting, for the SMEs, to get your weekends back. So we really wanted to make banking easier for the SME sector. A bit about the technology side. The programming was done. We were using extreme programming as our development approach. That involved pair programming, a lot of pair programming, hardcore 9 to 5 every day for everyone. It also meant test-driven development, which was, from a tester's perspective, absolutely amazing. We loved that. We had test-infected developers. The technology stack was a Java house, RabbitMQ, typical Jenkins type deployment. We were deploying at the time out of fortnightly releases, but our aspiration was really to get down to be able to deploy 2 or 3 times a day. And one of the things that we were constantly working on was how can we improve our testing to be able to get to the point where we can do that. So we didn't want to compromise our quality. We're talking about transactions here. The risk profile is a lot higher for us about transactions, performance, security, reliability, all these different aspects we had to take into a lot of consideration. We're playing with people's money. So that was very important to us. At the same time, along with all that stuff that was going on, we're in rapid growth, right? So like many small companies, we were expanding rapidly. Just to give you an example of what that was like, we were in the 8 months, the first 8 months I was there, I went from 5 testers to 23. So, and the development teams were having the same sort of rapid growth. So anyone who's been familiar in that environment knows that, you know, that onboarding process can be really draining for people when you're wanting to deploy software rapidly and you're trying to really deploy software iteratively and rapidly, because you need time to train people up, you need time for people to understand the context, the code, how things work. And we really understood that it took at least 3 months for people to get the hang of pair programming and test-driven development. So there was this sort of desire to change and move very rapidly, but also we had this constant flux going on. And one more thing was that we were actually creating greenfield products. So, you know, we were developing a deposits product. We're developing a loans product from scratch. And this meant that we didn't necessarily have, all our software was developed in-house. We weren't using third-party products at all. So, which was great for us because we could reiterate very, very quickly. We could refactor very, very quickly. But the downside is that we were really inventing things from day one. And this played a huge part in some of the decisions we made as we were moving to a microservices structure. So my part in this was that I was called in 2014 to really look at some of the testing practices that were in there. As I mentioned, it was, you know, extreme programming, so all the teams were developers. But they did have 5 testers who, at the end of every fortnight, basically had this software chucked over the fence to them, and they had sort of 2 days to scramble around and do as much testing as possible before that deployment happened, which everyone recognized was not ideal, right? We all wanted to get better at doing that. It meant that from the testers' perspective, they had no idea what was going on in the teams. There was a lot of verbal communication, as you can imagine, with pair programming, a lot of discussions happening that the testers weren't necessarily part of. So often they would scramble the last 2 days to really figure out, well, what are we testing? Why are we testing it in this way? What are the decisions that were made? There was all a kind of black box to them about what had happened, so they had no real context there, and that was very hard for them to test. And also on this, as you know, from the developer's perspective, is just getting that late feedback. It just really sucks. So, you know, we wanted to get better at how can we move that whole shifting left concept. How can we move the testing earlier and earlier? So that was happening at the same time. But also, when I came in, at the time, I was a very huge proponent of exploratory testing. And I wanted to work at how could we create a test-infected environment, really. So how that we could constantly be thinking of how we're going to test this. And now the advantage of coming from the advantage that everyone was doing test-driven development on the development side meant absolutely that we had that. You know, that the developers were constantly thinking of how am I going to test this, how am I going to test this. But I really wanted to bring in that concept of we don't want to necessarily just test for what we know, but we want to test for the unknowns. So there was a lot of emphasis when I first came in about focusing on testing, identifying what are the risks, what are the threats to quality, what do we care about, and how can we actually test for that, as opposed to testing for, you know, does it do what it's supposed to do. Okay, so this kind of how it's split up. It's not necessarily how we started off with, but by the end of it, this is sort of what it was looking like. So we had engineers who were in the coding side, who were focusing on test-driven development. They were focusing on PACT. So we very, very rapidly introduced PACT, and we were using that from the early days while testing microservices. We investigated into doing cross-system testing. Now, we knew we had all watched the video about J.B. Rainsberger's integration tests are a scam. And so we were very reluctant to kind of invest heavily into these sort of integration tests. But we did experiment a little bit with nearest neighbor cross-system Selenium tests to provide some sort of assistance to us about, are we sort of heading in the right direction? But there was quite a bit of conflict around that, whether that was the right way to actually do our testing. Other things that we were looking at were sort of performance testing. Really, we worked in quite a usual way. We didn't necessarily, because we were developing products in a sort of lean approach, we didn't necessarily know what that product was going to be or what that product was going to look like. So we didn't even know if that product was a product that our customers would want, right? So in all that sort of uncertainty and flux, we would not necessarily invest in heavy amounts of performance testing because we just didn't know whether actually we were developing the right product. I'm not sure whether that was, in hindsight, that was a great decision, but it's certainly the decision we felt at that time was the right decision. And security testing, so from a security perspective and being in the banking sector, this was hugely important to us. We decided, we had a bit of a discussion about what's the best approach. Should everyone be responsible for security, or should we actually have a security team? And we decided on the former. So we put everyone on training, developers and testers alike, to be able to avoid putting in security loopholes and flaws, and secondly, that we all had basic training on what to do. Since this happened, I think that's changed, and there is actually a security team as well as doing that training for everyone. The other thing that's really might be worthwhile mentioning as well is that we didn't have a continuous delivery pipeline. And this kind of played out a little bit, as you'll see. So what were the testers doing? The testers were looking at risk-based testing. And when I talk about that, it's not necessarily what a lot of people think about risk-based testing as in, yeah, it's a way of prioritizing your tests. That's not necessarily what I mean. What I'm talking about with risk-based testing is actually focusing on where are the threats, where are the potential risks, and how can we actually target our testing in that space. So as opposed to an exhaustive testing strategy, we wanted to have a more targeted approach and focus valuable testing in specific spaces rather than trying to do a blanket all. And this was really important when it came to testing microservices, because if any of you are aware, in the microservices space, I mean, it's an infinite amount of tests out there, right? And really, if we try and do an exhaustive approach, we're going to end up just spinning our wheels. So having this risk-based approach was really important. Exploratory testing played really nicely into that, and I spent a lot of time training people up on exploratory testing and helping them identify a systematic approach to exploratory testing on deep problems rather than just playing around on a GUI. Another thing that we looked at that became more and more important was also the business process. I call it business process testing, but it's probably not a great word for it. But we identified that really, because you have a feature that's done, doesn't necessarily mean it works well for your business. And an example of this was you might develop a feature or a button and something on a system, and then when it goes to the business person, they end up using it 100 times during that day, and it becomes completely unusable for them. So for us, it was really important that we provide that information into the development teams as early on as possible. So we had one tester who basically spent all their time down with the business, understanding how the business worked, and they would relay that information up to the dev teams in order to be able to include that information into the story planning and the testing. Security testing, as I said, we also had our performance testing. We spent a lot of time, again, targeted. So we focused our performance testing on very predominantly the switch at the time, but we did it in such huge detail. It was the most beautiful performance testing. It was even down to the chips. We had the chips, the same type of chips as we had in production. Like, we were very, very specific about how well that production environment, that performance environment replicated production. And of course, the necessary test environment maintenance, which was, as we went on the microservices journey, became a massive headache. So just to take a step back, I'm sure you're all familiar with microservices, but I wanted to emphasize the concept about bounded context. I myself here today have a bounded context because I've told that the camera up there will only film me from here to there, and if I move down there, it won't be able to film me. So there's my bounded context. But in microservices, we want to have that concept of bounded context. It helps us to be able to develop rapidly, test, and deploy independently from our nearest neighbors. And that's really important, right? Because we all know from those bad old Waterford days when we had these massive systems integration testing phases that prevented us from actually deploying rapidly. So the great thing about the microservices is that we can now do that independently of worrying about what's happening around us. Well, that's the theory anyway, right? And also, other things that I saw sort of come out is that teams were actually able to experiment and explore with what was happening inside their context. So they might use a different language depending on what problem they were trying to solve. So that was really interesting to see how people experimented with allowing themselves to try new things within that bounded context. Loosely coupled, we had a REST API or APIs that basically integrated between those. So we had something like this. I'm sure you're all familiar with this. A couple of teams would maybe look after, artifacts. We started off with 2 artifacts. We grew to 6, 20. By the time I'd finished, we had 80 microservices. I hear now they have 120. So, there was a really huge amount of artifacts that were being built. And there was a valid reason for that, but it really made it very, very interesting dilemma. So these were the problems that we were facing. I think about microservices and that concept, easy to develop, harder to test, nightmare to deploy. And that really echoed how our experience at the time. It doesn't mean we didn't have a lot of fun, by the way. We did have a lot of fun testing microservices. We learned an incredible amount doing that, but certainly it wasn't without its challenges. So that Martin Fowler article that says you must be this high to use microservices. And it basically talks about you need to have rapid deployment, good monitoring, and rapid application deployment. I think we had one of those, right? So we didn't have a pipeline. Now, the reason why we didn't have the pipeline is that we were actually developing it in parallel. It wasn't that we didn't want one, but we were spending a lot of effort and time in developing an immutable pipeline that we were going to use. So rather than wait for this pipeline to be built, which we knew was going to take a little while, what we wanted to do was to actually start developing microservices and learn about the microservices, how to develop microservices well. So we were doing this in parallel to this amazing pipeline that we were going to get, but it did mean that we had to do a lot of manual stuff. And as the number of microservices grew, this started to become really painful. The other thing was that we're using lean product principles. We really wanted to go out to our customers, go out to the SMEs and say, what do you want in a banking product? We didn't want to mimic CBA or Westpac or whoever. We wanted to be able to speak to our clients, our SMEs, and really understand what they wanted out of their product. How can we get your weekends back? And so because of that, we wanted to really adopt an iterative approach to developing that product. Now, the reality in that situation means is that there's a lot of uncertainty, right? We don't really know what that product is going to look like. And if you can imagine, if we take that a step into developing microservices, it meant that we really didn't know what the domain was looking like. And so we really didn't know quite how to split the context, the bounded context, into those places. There's an interesting talk about articles about, from developing microservices that it's actually, some people argue that it's actually easier to develop microservices when you have an existing monolith and you split that monolith up, and then so you can actually have, your abstraction is much easier to make because you know exactly where your contexts are going to be. But we were working from the bottom up, and that meant that we had an incredible amount of refactoring to do because we would create a bounded context and go, oh my goodness, that's not the right one. Let's re-break that. Let's change that boundary. Let's change the database schema and make changes to that and refactor that way. So whilst it was an incredible amount of learning, it was also an incredible amount of change and uncertainty going on. So hence the knowing where that abstraction became hard. We had some performance and security trade-offs. So what we recognized, we started realizing that, okay, yes, we had made we didn't necessarily have performance testing or performance as our key thing in the early days. But we did suddenly realize and tweak we were passionate about security and we were locking everything down, right? So we were taking some of the principles of OWASP and we were really trying to lock down everything we could in order to make our artifacts as secure as possible. The downside to that was that there's a trade-off in that. And the trade-off became in setting up the test environments, so creating security tokens for 80 microservices. The other trade-off was that actually does hit performance. And we were kind of aware of that. We weren't doing, as I said before, we weren't doing a lot of formalized performance testing. But as the number of microservices started increasing, we sort of going, maybe this is something we should be starting to measure and look at. And certainly from the testing team, we would start sort of creating sort of very informal tests to identify, is there a potential problem here that needs to be raised and brought up to the rest of the development teams, the engineering teams. So that was a split brain. We had a lot of redundancy because we had 2 different data centers. We wanted to make sure that we had redundancy in everything. So all our artifacts were duplicated, and this started causing some split brain problems that we had to work with. These were really tended to be dealt with within the engineering teams. From a testing perspective, we weren't involved heavily into that, which I think was a shame, but there we are. And again, as I mentioned, performance testing, that we would actually do some early on performance testing. We would tend to sort of swarm and create these teams where we would target potential risks that we saw coming up. And this became one of our really defining strategies for testing microservices, was this ability to quickly and rapidly create teams to identify potential problems and target those problems and provide evidence. As I said, a lot of fun. Okay, so put this all together, and we can't do a talk these days without bringing in the Cynefin framework, right? At least once. So here we go, Cynefin. But we were very much working in the complex space, a huge amount of uncertainty. And when we're working in that complex space, it's really important that we have a strategy that works well in that space. And this is one of the main reasons why I was trying to have an alternative approach to only automating, right? If you look at Martin Fowler's talks about testing microservices, it's very much about having different testing at different abstractions. So do you have unit, do you have component testing, you've got packed, end-to-end automation testing. But really that only tells part of the story. For me, that in this context, in particular, in this complex zone, that we really needed a strategy that allowed us to rapidly respond to change. And having an automation, emphasize and relying on automation only wasn't going to bring us that. One of the things that we really discovered was that risk has no boundaries, right? This is one of the challenges we realized, was that it was all very well focusing on the bounded context and testing, we'll test within that context. But in a sense, that's not where the risk lay. And this sort of started becoming really obvious as we grew in the number of microservices. And I've thought a lot about this in the past. It's like, well, why is it that necessarily the bugs, we were finding bugs that were outside of the bounded context or between bounded contexts, And to some degree, I think that the concept of microservices and that bounded context is also its Achilles heel. Because when we focus on something, we develop tunnel vision. We've developed, in order to be able to focus, we defocus other things and we leave them out. And to some degree, that means that we are inherently potentially causing problems outside that we're not aware of. And I think that this became something that sort of pattern that emerged as we were testing. We were discovering actually the bugs are we're not necessarily finding the bugs. It's when two teams are working on different artifacts and there's no communication or there's miscommunication between the teams, and that's where the problems are starting to appear. We're not realizing the impact of making this change somewhere else. Yes, we had Pact there to try and mitigate some of the REST API contracts and if there were changes in the contracts. But that doesn't necessarily mean that from a systems level, that things weren't being missed from sense of a feature or how does the project work together as a whole. And sometimes that sort of architectural level, that systems level was being missed out and overlooked. But it wasn't all doom and gloom. We did do some things really, really well. And I guess it's a bit of a break session for me and for the team, for the whole organization. I think we did collaboration really well and talked about those risks outside of those bounded contexts. We worked hard to create methods in which we could improve collaboration. So very much inside the testing practice, and we had about 23 testers at the time, and we would constantly meet together to share information and share knowledge. And as each tester was building a mental model of what they were working on and their artifacts, this was being shared across the teams. And often it was the tester who would come to the other teams and say, oh, actually, do you know this team is working on this area and that might have an impact on what we're doing. So that proved to be really invaluable. But it's also from a team perspective, we had Scrum, we called it Scrum of Scrums, where twice a week the dev leads would also meet together and share information. So we were working hard to try and mitigate that risk and try and provide a much more collaborative environment where that could be done. We put a lot of emphasis into coaching. So one of the things was being able, if you want to have a strategy where people can respond quickly, they need to be good at what they do. They need to understand the context, they need to have good skills, and you need to be able to trust them, and you need to help them have the confidence to make those sorts of decisions. And I'm a big believer that coaching can help you do that. And I'm not talking about coaching in the sense of coaching, I'm talking about coaching skill. Like, how do you actually make good decisions in testing? How do you make good decisions in development? How do you know what is good code in a sense? So we're focused on really from a technical perspective, or is it that skills-based, how do we get better at what we're doing? So that every tester knew when they were working in their team, because there was one tester per team, that they had the confidence to be able to assist that team and make decisions, with a lot of support in the background, of course. And one of the things I became more and more aware of was that really, for my role, it was about providing that space for people to grow and helping people to become better at what they do. And sometimes that meant failure, and that was okay. So great emphasis on learning, discovering new things, sharing information. Another thing that we looked at was, again, I'm talking about this sort of bounded context and the focus on looking at the parts only. And it really came to me quite early on as we were growing in the microservices that, we were focusing on the sum of the parts, but that only told part of the story. Why were we developing software? What was the problem that we were trying to solve by developing the software? And I like to say that, the customer doesn't actually give a damn. about whether you're using microservices, serverless, whether you're using a monolith. They just have a problem that they want solved. They want a tool that can help them get their job done. And the question is that, are we helping them solve that question? So it's not necessarily that we can forget about the bounded context, but we must never forget why we're doing what we do. And I think one of the big values of having the testers come work with the business and work closely with the product owners was to bring that knowledge really close to the teams and help kind of share that information. So one of the things that we did this, and I've touched on a little bit, was did this through diversification. And this became a big theme in our strategy and what we did. And I'm going to touch on 3 things that we really focused on that I think that we did well. I apologize for this picture. I ran out of ideas for how do you think about test environments. So there's a picture of a nice cloud. So one of the things that, as I said, you know, we had this wonderful pipeline that was going to arrive anytime soon, and we're all going to be happy little Vegemites because we had our continuous delivery pipeline. But because of that, we didn't really necessarily want to invest heavily into test environments that we had right now. But it became a real problem. We had this one test environment. It was you know, but it was good. We had all the artifacts in there, and we would put them on a fortnightly basis. We had invested in having one person who was responsible for taking an image of production and making sure that everything was up to date and that the test environment was clean. But still, this test environment became really, really popular. Because we had the devs who were really, really invested in testing, one of the things that they would do was they always wanted to do what they called a manual test before they hit that final button and said, yeah, it's good. So this test environment started becoming really popular with everyone. Everyone wanted to get on it and just do that final check. And so it got to the point where actually the integrity of the test started to be challenged because we never really knew what state the artifacts were in. And so this was becoming a real problem for us. One of the things that we decided to do was to invest in mini production environments. Now, our pipeline was going to be immutable. It was going to be as close to production as we could possibly make it. So we thought it would be a good idea anyway to get used to that idea of let's shift really, really, really left. You know, let's try and have a production environment in a local, you know, in a local space. Let's try that and see what happens. And so we invested in purchasing, I think it was about 6 boxes, and we put 1 box under each team. And it was about 300 gigabytes of memory, I think it was at the time. So it took quite a few of the microservices. If you think the default microservices, what's it, 8 gigabytes of RAM. So, you know, we were kind of thinking, okay, this will be okay. And so we got an image of production, cleaned it up, and we had this process. We deployed it onto those boxes every fortnight. And this was really freed up the space, and it allowed people could actually test whenever they wanted in a production-like environment. Fantastic. Hooray. It also had an interesting side effect because what happened is that the developers started really experiencing what it was like to manually set up 80 microservices. And if you give people, if people feel that pain, then suddenly alternatives to increasing extra microservices starts to really, you know, be questioned. And it really, I think it was a great learning exercise for everyone to actually go through that deployment process for themselves, for the teams. And they could feel the challenges it took to actually set up a test environment and ultimately deploy, right, as well, because our deployment times were becoming longer and longer and longer because of all these microservices. So it was very interesting to see that and to see the impact of that on decisions that were being made. So that was a very interesting side effect. And people really started getting frustrated by the fact that they had to spend so much time setting up the local test environments. And, you know, that really, in a sense, makes the problem visible. You know, I'm not necessarily, I look at these things, I don't necessarily think, oh, that's a bad thing that happened. That's a great thing that happened, right? That's a learning experience that everyone can benefit from. And the same with having that terrible one machine with, you know, everyone using that one machine. It sort of really brought out to the open the potential risks that we were creating in trying to have a microservices architecture which was so manual and so cumbersome and heavy to actually configure and set up. I mean, it wasn't all bad. We did have some in-house tools to help us do some of the deployments. It wasn't like we're doing everything absolutely manually, but we didn't have an approach where we could rapidly deploy security tokens and things like that. So, yeah, so that was kind of cool that we did that. Also, we had started focusing on testing in production. So one of the big final frontiers of banking is testing in production. Like you talk to any risk auditor and their the hairs will go on the back of their heads if you talk about testing in production. It's really, really scares them. And there are some, every person has a horror story about how we did some testing in production and it went wrong and we cost the company billions and billions of dollars. And so this is something that we treated with really kid gloves. We went about on a sort of small iterative approach, and step by step we wanted to give people the confidence that with the right technology and the right strategy, this could be achieved. And so one of the first things we did was we had an artifact that had an external REST API. And for us, we were not having access to external APIs at all in our development environments or anything like that. So it was really a big no-no to be testing that and sort of opening that up. So we used that reason to test that in production. So we basically, rather than trying to solve that problem internally, we went to the risk auditors and we said, look, you know, the best way to test this is actually testing this in production. Can you give us that permission to do that? And just by creating a feature flag and being able to create that in that test environment was the first step forward to actually thinking about testing in production. We also use the concept of actually, if we don't test in production, the risk is going to be bigger. In the long run, testing in production is where we have to move. And if we fail to go forward, we're actually creating more risk by not actually doing this because it's so hard to test this prior to production. And really, we need to start seriously thinking about how we're going to manage this. So that's where we were heading at the time. As I mentioned, so I'll move on. We mentioned we were doing a lot of swarming, and we found that this was very effective to identifying problems. And we had teams of both developers and testers swarming sometimes, or else it was just all testers, depending on what the job was. We also spent a lot of time diversifying the task data. So in banking, one of the things that we felt was where we could really add value was that, you know, testing with one piece of data provides you with like some value. But if you have a diverse range of test data, your tests are going to be so much more meaningful. And we're going to potentially find a lot of different types of bugs by doing that. So we wanted tools to be able to inject test data into our artifacts really quickly. So as an exploratory testing approach is get the system into a certain state and then explore it at that state rather than trying to explore it from a clean state. So this is a classic kind of exploratory testing approach. And we wanted to be able to do that really, really quickly. So we got the developers to develop, using the APIs, to develop some methods of injecting test data into the system. We also looked at sort of trying to take the production database schema and actually create snapshots of test data that we could quickly load in to artifacts. That proved to be a lot harder than we first imagined. We never quite got that off the ground by the time I had finished up working there. But certainly it was that concept of how can we actually get that sort of information, or how can we get the data into a certain state without too much effort. And I think that you'll find that this is one of, you know, really this is a very useful approach to helping improve the quality of the testing that's performed. One of my big bugbears with contract is that it only, it's always one value. It's like, I know it's not trying to test the data in consumer-driven contract testing, but the contract that it's testing is very, very simple, to some degree. And I always worried, being the skeptical tester, it's like, is that enough? And like, are we going to say that's good enough to say? And is there a better way of increasing diverse ranges of data within something like, I don't think necessarily PACT is the place to do it, but is there a way we can sort of diversify our data in that API testing? So that was just another idea we were working on. So skill sets I touched on. We had a business process tester who would come in and learn about that. We also had test ops. We developed a test ops team to help support those test environments and to keep them clean and that infrastructure. And that was starting to become a major, major part of our work. And I could foresee that in the future, this was actually going to really become valuable for the whole organization. And then obviously we had the testers who focused on working very closely with the developers too. Of course, it wasn't all plain sailing. I look back a little bit, and as I said, this is quite an old story. Things have changed dramatically since I was there. I hear they're now on to weekly deploys, and I wouldn't be surprised if that's even changed. I think that if I look back and say, well, what would we have done differently? It's not necessarily that we had done it, that we did what we did badly. I think the choices that we made at the time were reasonable choices. But I think considering where we are today, within the, where we are today and the ideas that are floating around, there's a lot of things that I would be taking on board now that I would be thinking of in my microservices testing strategy that I hadn't necessarily thought of. I read this article, so one of the first things is this is about ownership of testing. And as we had in our team, we had the testers working sort of like test leads in each development team. So they weren't fully cross-functional teams, but certainly the tester there was kind of the person who would, whose goal was to create the strategy. And I think that to some degree that has to change. I think that really what's important is that we have a strategy that both developers and testers own. If we're really serious about quality being everyone's responsibility, this needs to be a co-ownership rather than something that's owned just by sort of one type of person. So we've got to move away from this concept of testers being gatekeepers and owners of quality, and that we sort of start looking at it as more of a service that we're providing to the whole team. So I think getting developers to input ideas and to share ideas and how that strategy would work and where that would go is a really important move that I would try and make. But also that when I talk about that's the kind of adhesion thing, is that we have this concept of, molecules that stick closely together and we work together. So yes, we would have testing working together in testing, but we also want that adhesion where the molecules are connecting to things that are not they're not the same type of molecules. So we want that connecting to other things. So we create this sort of, combination of both working together and also working with other types of people as well. I'd like to see us focusing on customer benefit. And I think this is a really great way of looking at quality and looking at testing and looking at it from a customer perspective and saying, well, how can we actually know that what we are providing to our customers is really adding value? And often so much we focus on, have we done that feature? Is that feature done? But rather than looking at that is asking the question, have we actually provided value to our business? And if we look at that and we ask that question, I feel from a testing perspective, we're going to create a lot of different types of tests rather than is that feature done. So it's really opening up that concept of how do we know that we're adding value to our customers. I'd like to forget about releases. Yay, no more releases. But this idea that we're release agnostic, and that really from a testing perspective, that means that we just want to do bloody good testing, right? Everywhere it is. We want to do it regardless of pre-release or post-release. We want to start thinking about, if we're deploying 3 or 4 times a day, it's not just about making that release perfect, but it's making the testing adding value before and after we release. And starting to move away from that sort of trying to make a perfect release, and that's our job is done. So, obviously that means looking at testing in production, but it means like potentially looking at performance testing that's constantly going, regardless of when you release, right? It's just ticking along, and oh, there's a blip, there's a release, right? Oh, that's interesting, something spiked. Why did that spike, right? That's interesting information. So looking at those sorts of things, I would like to see that a lot more in the future. Obviously, the use of feature flags and stuff like that I mentioned before. I'd like to see some new utilities. I'd like to consider speed as a quality attribute, right? I think, 10 or 20 years ago, it was all about the large eating the small. Really, we're talking about the fast eating the slow. And if we're thinking about, typically in the past, quality and speed has always been a conflict, right? We can't have good quality unless we slow down. If we speed up, we're going to compromise quality. It's like, really? Can we have speed as a quality attribute? And that maybe we start looking at that from a testing and a quality perspective, and how well are we doing that? And I know that already there's movements to talk about, all these different aspects, but from testing, do we really look at those sorts of things? So I'd like to see that sort of being encompassed more into the quality space. I'm a big fan of recoverability. I think the concept, yes, we want to test as well as we can before we release, but are we actually measuring and testing for recoverability? How well are we doing in that space, and how do we know we're good at recoverability? So just trying to start thinking about, how are we testing for these things? Are we measuring these things? And finally, observability. I was really fortunate to go to OliCon in San Francisco, which is Charity Major's conference there. And that was just a real eye-opener about, how good are we at actually being able to detect problems? How well are we designing our systems for things like testability and observability, so that when there is a problem, we can actually detect that problem really, really quickly. So looking at those sorts of things from a quality perspective and encompassing that into our quality strategy. So we're not necessarily trying to test the bejesus out of microservices. We're trying to look at things from a more holistic point of view. I like the concept of emergent quality. The idea that if we look after the ecosystem, that a quality product will emerge, right? So we're looking at things like how well is our infrastructure, we're looking at what our processes are like, we're looking at a lot of different things that actually help that product become a quality product. It's interesting when you look at places like Google and they talk about how psychological safety is such a big important thing into producing quality code. And I'm like, well, that's really interesting. Maybe if we're looking at these sorts of things, then our quality product will naturally improve. Okay, I'm going to end up with this. This is one of the ways that this is kind of my fait accompli in collaboration. So one of the teams had a really amazing tester, and she had this not necessarily very exciting job. One of the payment terminals, the kernel had to be changed. And in order to actually put it back out into production, we had to do some load testing on PayWave. And this was going to be a huge problem because we didn't have a robotic arm to constantly put in front of the terminals. And it meant potentially that this tester was going to have to sit there for maybe ever and sort of flick this card, right? Which is a really, really, really bad way to test. And it's really bad testing. We didn't want to do that. We didn't want to do bad testing. And so she went to the team and she said to the team, look, could you help me out? I have to do this type of testing. How am I going to be able to do this? Is there a way we can automate this? And there happened to be a train enthusiast on the team. And that train enthusiast came up with this idea of having a train and attaching the credit card to the engine, and it would go around. Let me see if I can get this work. Oh, it's not working. Oh, no. All right, well, if you can imagine this train just going around in circles. No, it's not going to work for me, is it? Oh, there we go. It's going around in circles, and as it passes the terminal, it's just tapping as it goes, right? So, yeah, so this was a way that we managed to do some load testing of. So we left it just for 3 days, and it went round and round, a very consistent rate. And for me, this was a great example of how when you get developers and testers working together to solve a problem. And this is fun, right? Why can't we all testing be like this? This would be really cool. So I think, you know, this is what we can achieve when we all get together and collaborate in a way. We can have a lot of fun, and we can do some really great testing. That is the end of my talk. I'm not sure if we have time for questions, but thank you very much for listening to me. I have left here, after this, a whole list of potential links to what I talked about. Please feel free to take that. I've certainly found this useful. In particular, there's a talk there that I actually didn't really mention, which is exploratory testing in production by Cindy. I can't see it there. Anyway, it's up there somewhere, but that's really useful to think about actually doing a lot of exploratory testing in production rather than rather than in the release testing. That's it. Thank you very much.